Königliche Hoheit,
Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, State Premiers, Mayor, MPs, Professor Müller-Steinhagen, guests, ladies and gentlemen, citizens of Dresden. Just a few months ago, on the 1st of September, I stood on the market square at dawn in a small town in Poland, Wielun. Most Germans won't know of it. Together with the Polish president, surrounded by many citizens mourning this event, we commemorated the bombing of the city 80 years before. On the 1st of September 1939, German Luftwaffe dive bombers brought death and destruction over Wielun without any prior warning. Their barrage of bombs hit an unsuspecting, defenseless, militarily utterly insignificant city. It devastated the hospital, flattened the market square, burnt down the historic center, killed, in these first few hours of the war, 1,200 people. The bombs of Wielun were the first crimes committed in a war that Nazi Germany inflicted on the world. These bombs were the harbingers of the atrocities of the German conviction of supremacy, of fanatic German racism, and the German desire for destruction that was unleashed in the following 6 years across Europe. It marked the beginning of a dissolution of any boundary on violence that cost more than 50 million people their lives in the Second World War. The 6 million Jews who were murdered, those tortured and murdered in the concentration camps we commemorated just a few weeks ago in Yad Vashem, Auschwitz, and Berlin. The attack on Wielun was the prelude to a brutal bombing war in which the civilian population in the cities were caught in the crossfire. The German Luftwaffe on the one side, British and American bombers on the other side, destroyed over the course of the war hundreds of cities in nearly all countries in Europe. In their wake followed a hitherto unknown trail of devastation extending from Britain through Germany to Russia. And as this war ended in May 1945 with the liberation of Europe from Nazi tyranny, huge stretches of the continent were in ashes and in ruins. Citizens of Dresden, today we have gathered here to remember the firebombing on Dresden 25 years ago. We commemorate the victims of the bombing war in this city and in Germany and in all of Europe. And we remember all victims of genocide, war, and violence. The inferno that was unleashed on Germany in the night from the 13th to the 14th of February 1945 was an inferno that eyewitnesses described again and again. The British planes firebombed the city in 2 waves. Incendiary and high explosive bombs launched a devastating firestorm. When the Americans continued the bombing on Ash Wednesday, they looked down at a burning city. Today we know that up to 25,000 people lost their lives then. Large parts of the historic center and adjacent residential areas were razed to the ground. Within just a few hours, the bombs destroyed much of what people had built up here in Dresden over centuries. And just who the bombs hit was left entirely up to chance. The bombs hit children, women, and men They hit Dresdeners, they hit refugees from East Prussia and Silesia, they hit soldiers and prisoners of war, they hit die-hard Nazis and Gestapo men, as well as hitting resistance fighters, forced laborers, and concentration camp inmates. And just as randomly as the bombs wiped out tens of thousands of lives, by chance they also saved a few lives. Jews like Henny Wolf or Victor Klemperer were able to pull the yellow star off their clothes and go into hiding or flee in the general chaos. Those who survived this firestorm were often severely scarred, emotionally and physically. The wailing of the sirens, the ominous roar of the planes, the red glow on the sky line, the fear for their lives and the cramped conditions in the cellars, the blasts of the bombs, the shattering glass and crashing walls around them, the raging fire that sucked all of the oxygen from streets and buildings and caves of rubble, the burnt people, the skeleton of a city. Countless eyewitnesses were unable to get these images, these sounds, these smells from this terrible night out of their heads. Fear and powerlessness have gnawed their way deep into their souls. And those who were forced to help as forced laborers, or those who offered to help to do things like recovering the disfigured corpses from the ruins, they could also never shake the horrors of that time, their whole lives long. Many captured what they experienced in notes, in letters, in diaries to try to ease this oppressive burden. Many told their children and grandchildren of what they had experienced. Some, years later, found the strength to talk about their history, encouraged also by a new public interest in the bombings and the debates about suffering and guilt that we have had since the end of the 90s in our country. Here in Dresden, it is the voices of Dora Baumgärtel and Lisbeth Flade, of Günther Jäckel, Götz Bergander, and many others who speak to us of this night and the misery that followed it. Many of the survivors never saw family members again. They had lost their homes and their personal keepsakes, only had what they were able to grab before they ran out of their homes when the sirens began to wail. Those who somehow managed to survive often sought refuge in the ruins of their hometown. Sometimes just a few words touch us, like the words that Lina Skoczowski wrote on a postcard just a few days after these attacks in Dresden. Dear Daddy, your three are united, but all is lost. And it's not just from Dresden that we hear reports like this. We know them from all German cities who suffered firebombing in the Second World War. Some again and again. We know them from Lübeck and Hamburg, Wuppertal and Cologne, Pforzheim and Würzburg, Darmstadt and Hanover, from Berlin and Potsdam, Halberstadt, Magdeburg, Rostock, Chemnitz, and many other cities. And we know similar reports and voices from cities in Italy and occupied France, from Naples and Geneva, Le Havre and Royan. We know them from the cities of Europe that were destroyed by the Germans, Luftwaffe, Warsaw and Rotterdam, London, Coventry, and Liverpool, from Belgrade, Leningrad, and many others as well. And we hear these voices from Guernica, the Basque city that German fighter planes of the Condor Legion razed to the ground already in 1937. Wolfram von Richthofen, who would later order the attack on Wielun, noted briefly in his diary the following: Guernica, a city of 5,000 inhabitants, literally flattened. You could still see the holes bombed into the streets. Just great. And it was this cynicism, so contemptuous of human life, that led to the disaster. Historical photos bear witness to the scale of the devastation in all of Europe. They remind us of what was lost forever in our cities, also here in Dresden. They give us a sense of the extent of the work done, primarily by the many women who, directly after the end of the war, made a start with reconstruction, often with their bare hands. And I believe that we should, indeed we must, try to gauge the fear and the pain and the despair of the victims and the survivors of the firebombing. I want to express my gratitude to those of you in Dresden and in many other places who have worked tirelessly towards keeping their memory alive. And at the same time, those who take a stand against those who want to misuse this remembrance to incite hatred and resentment. It is also thanks to the commitment of these people that we can say the victims of the firebombing are not forgotten. Their lives and their fates remain inscribed in our collective memory. And it is my firm conviction that anyone who examines the history of their family or their city in the bombing wars can better understand what other people suffered in other places. Truthful remembrance teaches us compassion. Truthful remembrance lets us see and understand what happened to our own communities and what's happening to others or happened to others in other communities. It lets us feel compassion for the fate of all victims of war and violence, far beyond our national borders. I want to thank everyone here in Dresden who, for years, have been expanding the horizons of remembrance and have sought connections with cities across the globe, from Coventry to Wrocław and St. Petersburg. Ladies and gentlemen, when we think back to the history of the bombing wars in our country, we remember two things. We remember the suffering of the people and German citizens in German cities, but also the suffering that Germans inflicted on others. We do not forget it was Germans who began this horrendous war. It was millions of Germans who waged it, not all, but many on the strength of their convictions. It was the Nazis and their willing executioners who set the mass murder of Jews in Europe in motion. And it was the Nazi regime that kept on murdering even when it knew the war was lost. We do not forget Germany's guilt, and we are committed to our lasting responsibility because of it. Ladies and gentlemen, if we remember back to the firebombing, we knew that even then, in Britain and among the Allies, the question was discussed as to whether carpet bombing, which killed also tens of thousands of soldiers of the Bomber Command, made military sense, was even permitted by international law, was morally legitimate. To this day, this question continues to interest philosophers, not least, as I'm aware, in Britain. And I believe that we need this dispassionate way of looking at all of this to understand how such an escalation of violence could come about. We need it to find responses to the question of which means might be necessary and acceptable to put an end to serious crimes. But, ladies and gentlemen, the question of the guilt of the Allies is heading in the wrong direction if it is posed to relativize German guilt. If we commemorate the victims and German citizens today, then it is not done in the spirit of recrimination or reproach, and certainly not about setting one crime off against another. Far too often and far too long, the history of the air raids on Dresden was ideologically twisted and politically appropriated, first by the Nazis, then by the East German regime. And in this year, once again, as the mayor said, we must be aware of the fact that political forces are attempting to manipulate this history, reinterpret it, misuse this history as a weapon. And this is why I want to say anyone who still counts the dead of Dresden against those killed in Auschwitz, anyone who tries to downplay German wrongs, anyone who falsifies historical facts against our better judgment, we must stand up to them as Democrats. We must contradict them loudly and clearly. But let me also say that anyone who ignores or trivializes the suffering of the people who died or suffered in the firebombing in this city, who think that this bombing was a quote-unquote just punishment, or who try to make gestures of mourning look ridiculous, they are also not doing justice to history and are mocking the victims. So let us work together for a commemoration that focuses on the suffering of the victims and the survivors, and at the same time seeks to understand the reasons for this suffering. And let us all join forces against those who misuse remembrance as an ammunition to fight their ideological battles. I am grateful that so many committed citizens here in Dresden have chosen this path and have gone on it for many years. The human chains that, as we've just heard, will join hands again today in their thousands is a strong symbol for a remembrance in the spirit of understanding. And I'm grateful that after this event I will join your ranks there. Ladies and gentlemen, guests, for many years now, you have not just focused on the history of the firebombing, but also on the history of your city under National Socialism. Not just to set off, or not rather to set off one suffering against another suffering, but rather to truly learn from the past for the future. We know that the destruction of the City of Culture of Dresden did not happen overnight and not just in February 1945. The destruction of the City of Culture of Dresden began in 1933, as did the destruction of many other cities of culture across Germany. It began when here, just a few weeks after the transfer of power to Hitler, books were burned on the streets. It began when the conductor, Fritz Busch, was shouted at by SA men until he left the Semper Opera House because he worked with Jewish and foreign musicians. When Otto Dix and other contemporary artists were hounded and Jewish academics were forced out of their positions. The destruction of the City of Culture of Dresden began when directors, writers, journalists, publishers, and many others besides were persecuted and driven out because they were Jews or because of their political convictions. Many, like the singer Theresa Elb and the actor Jenny Schaffer-Bernstein, were later deported and murdered. And what happened in this city, too, was a sign of what was to come when, in the night of the 9th of November 1938, many years before the Semper Opera House, the Semper Synagogue was set on fire. Ladies and gentlemen, the destruction of reason The destruction of culture, the destruction of civic society began here in Dresden when perfectly ordinary citizens of Dresden boycotted Jewish shops, when they forced their neighbors out of public life, out of schools, out of parks, and many cozied up to the Nazi regime or simply turned a blind eye and were silent. At the heart of this city lived countless forced laborers from Dresden and across Europe who were made to produce ammunition and weapons. The Nazi judiciary murdered their political opponents on Münchner Platz Square, and in the Pirna Sonnenstein, sick and disabled people were gassed to death. In Zeithain, near Riese, thousands of Soviet prisoners of war starved to death. And here, too, in Dresden, remembrance leads us to the very depths of the Nazi abyss. Here in this city, since 1933 on, human lives were treated with contempt. Human dignity was trampled upon. We commemorate these victims as well, and we remember their suffering. We do not do it to justify other suffering, but we do it as well to pose a question which is relevant to all of us today, the question of how, in an apparently civilized society, all dams could break, all rules of humaneness and humanity could be thrown overboard, and atrocious violence could be unleashed. The firebombing of Dresden reminds us of the destruction of the rule of law and democracy in Weimar Republic, and nationalist conviction of supremacy and contempt for human life, anti-Semitism, and fanatic racism. And ladies and gentlemen, I fear that these dangers have not yet been averted, because we experience how in some countries there's a growing desire for a fortress mentality. A fascination with the authoritarian is increasing. We experience how at the heart of Europe the freedom of press, of art, of science is being restricted again. And we are also experiencing in our country as well how anti-Semitism and racism are beginning to poison public life again, how states governed by the rule of law and democratic institutions are being scorned, their representatives insulted and attacked. Ladies and gentlemen, if elected members of parliament are mocked and ridiculed in the parliaments in which they sit, then this is an attempt to destroy democracy from within. Guests, it is not enough when Democrats shudder and turn away in disgust. None of this can remain unchallenged in our country. We must oppose hatred and incitement to it, reject offensive statements, counter prejudice. We must all, no matter how acrimonious the political dispute itself is, conduct discussions with reason and decency and protect the institutions of democracy. There's a clear boundary between a liberal democracy that protects the dignity of the individual and an authoritarian nationalist policy which wants to exclude those who think differently and live differently as enemies of the alleged true people. And it is down to us to defend this boundary. And it's not just up to politicians to do it. It's true for every one of us, because all of us, in our own way, bear responsibility for the way people live together in our country, for democracy in our country. And this, too, is a lesson we have learned from the German aberration which led to the destruction of Dresden. And we must take this lesson seriously for a good and peaceful future. Let us send this signal out here from Dresden. And, ladies and gentlemen, in a few months, we will be commemorating the end of the Second World War and the liberation from Nazi tyranny 75 years ago. In May 1945, for the surviving victims and those persecuted by the Nazi regime, for the first time, once again, there was something resembling a future. At the same time, many people on our continent felt the situation was hopeless, and God knows, not just in Germany. In the rubble fields of the bombed cities, no one dared believe that Europe might one day have a future. But in the mountains of rubble, in the ruins, a wish emerged. Louder and louder the call, never again. For many who had survived the war, this became their mission in life. Never again was the start of a long history of peace and reconciliation in Europe, which, in its inception, no one could believe could be possible. We do not forget, already in the 1950s, men and women in Coventry reached out their hands in reconciliation. In Coventry, that city that the German Luftwaffe had razed to the ground in 1940, the cross of nails in Coventry, put together from 3 nails from destroyed cathedrals, remains a strong symbol of peace and understanding. And we do not forget how many Britons and Americans, after German unification, donated money so we could rebuild the Frauenkirche Cathedral here in Dresden. The golden orb and cross, designed by the son of a British bomber pilot, is a beacon of reconciliation that shines out far beyond this city. I am grateful that together we can commemorate the bombing of Dresden with representatives of our former wartime enemies. Commemorating together binds us over borders. Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, I am grateful. We are all grateful for this gesture of friendship. The path that a few set out on in those days, this path of reconciliation led to a unified Europe. This Europe is a lesson learned from centuries of war and devastation, from hatred and violence. It has emerged from the spirit of resistance against racist hatred and totalitarianism, from a spirit of freedom, of democracy and justice. And together we have reached a great deal. We Germans, Your Royal Highness, regret that Britain has now left the European Union, but we know that we will remain partners, for our friendship is a deep one. What unites us, I assure you, is stronger than what divides us, and divided us most recently in the conflict about the EU. After this terrible war, the nations of the world created standards for a system to preserve the peace, which was to be based on human rights and international law, especially in a time in which we are seeing a declining will to peaceful cooperation in some places. We, as Germans, want to take on our historic responsibility and defend this blueprint for a lasting peace, because together with our partners, we know any peace is fragile. In November 2018, in London, I stood at the cenotaph, the War Memorial on Whitehall, and commemorated the dead of the First World War with Prince Charles. I laid down a wreath with a note on it that said, I'm honored to commemorate the dead here at your side. I am grateful for the reconciliation, and I look full of hope to a future in peace and friendship. Ladies and gentlemen, let us continue along this path of reconciliation. Let us take shared responsibility for preserving the peace, and let us protect the dignity of every single person here in Dresden, especially. Thank you very much.